format is while there are a few mastermind members on here, most of the folks are other clients, friends, contacts, subscribers, product customers from other parts, and it's pretty informal. We'll have some conversation about what's on people's minds, and then each time I have a little bit of information. Today we're going to talk about economically fragile caregivers, and it ties into some new things we've been doing, and really in the fall with all of our mastermind groups and with this group looking at caregiver recruiting and retention, of course, which is on everybody's mind. And there's Bob Roth, and so that's the format. It's pretty informal, whatever people want to talk about. Robert Olson's on there. Hi, Robert. How are you? Can you hear us? You're muted. If you want to talk to us, you can unmute. Jean Caldwell is on there. Hi, Jean.
How you doing?
I'm terrific. How are you, my friend?
Well, we're dodging hurricanes right now.
Yeah, you got two of them headed your way. That's a first, isn't it? Two hurricanes in the Gulf at the same time.
Yeah, Marco, it's been like a really bad game of Marco Polo with the first one. Nobody can find him, but that's a good thing. But the second one will probably be quite different. So yeah. Please pray for us.
We will absolutely do that.
Indeed.
You and your family be safe down there.
Thank you.
Looks like Ari Medoff is on there. Hi, Ari. How are you today? We're going to give folks in just another minute to get in, and then we'll jump in. While we're waiting for other folks to come in, we're going to talk a little bit about economically fragile caregivers and some new research we've been doing. But in the meantime, I thought we would do just a quick go around the room and find out from everyone, what are the big burning issues that you're facing in your business as a result of COVID and the protests and other things going on, the closing of businesses, all those pieces. And I'm sure it's affected your business in some ways. So what are the, I'm gonna just ask people to tell us the three burning issues that you are facing going forward. And you can either unmute yourself and tell us what those are, or you can type them into the chat box. The chat box is in your control panel at the bottom of your screen. If you're on your computer, if you're on a tablet, it's probably up on the top of the screen there. Hi, Ralph Fern. I see you're on. I can't see your face, but I see you're on. How are you today? Not hearing us. Okay. Well, let's think about that. If you would just make a note there on your tablet or whatever you have there of what are the three big burning issues that you are facing as you go forward, coming out of summer, heading into fall, and perhaps things that you would like to address in future issues of office hours. And you can either unmute yourself and tell me what those are, or you can type them into the chat box. For those of you that have your cameras on, that means to me you want to participate in the conversation, so I'm going to go around and call on you. And for those of you that don't have your camera on, you're welcome to unmute and participate, or you can be a passive observer. So I'm just going to go around my screen. For those of you not familiar, I have my friend and professional speaking colleague from here in Louisville and my trout fishing buddy, Conway Stone's on with me. Say hi, Conway. So let me go around the room for those of you on camera and unmute yourself and tell us your three big burning issues. Glenn Lane, will you go first? What are the big burning issues you're facing?
Sure. Well, the chat window is already populating with the caregiver side, so no need to really repeat that, other than the normal challenges of recruiting, plus whatever is going to happen with the unemployment supplement, plus whatever. I would put that number one on my list right now. Preparing for a second wave would be number two, from every angle. A lot of lessons learned from the first wave, around types of clients we take, types we don't take, PPE, and all that associated stuff. And then continuing the business improvement that we took on as we moved remotely. Operational improvement, getting rid of paper, straight through processing, all that sort of stuff we made huge strides on, but still not there yet.
Okay,
That would be my
terrific.
three.
Glenn, thank you. And while you're talking about it, Glenn, I was just on a call with someone else who was talking about unemployment claims, and you mentioned that. What are you seeing with unemployment claims?
So less about the unemployment claims than the tug on the workforce in New York of being able to make 1,104 a week prior to the 600 going away versus what we pay. And now it looks like it's going to be 804, that the 300 of the 400 Trump talked about is going to come into effect state by state at their option. So it's the pull of that, because even at 804, perceived zero risk in spite of your ability to fight it and all that stuff, I think it is diverting some of the workers.
Okay, good. Thanks, Glenn. Always appreciate being here. Sandy McCann, what are your burning issues you're facing these days?
I'm off mute. Okay. I know people talked about the hiring enough caregivers. Of course, that's always a challenge, but I think specifically our challenge right now is scheduling. We had this whole scheduling, redo at the beginning of COVID, one caregiver with one client, just really reducing down. And that worked when our hours, had dipped. And it also worked because the caregivers understood, and everybody can rally around a crisis for a few weeks or a month or so. But we've sort of returned to, caregivers picking and choosing where they want to go. And we're just really having a difficult time maintaining that scheduling, to protect both the caregiver and the client. And so I feel we're really shaky around that. We're doing it. Our hours are as high as they've ever been, but it's we're back to the same revolving door of caregiver, and I'm really troubled about that. That's really, I think, the number one issue for us. It's tied into so many other things, including adequate PPE. We have PPE that we source from Amazon Business. Thanks, Glenn, for telling me about Amazon Business. But it's, the gowns that we got, they say that they're okay, but they look paper thin. And we were planning on a couple of months of sourcing PPE, and we've got funds, we've got cash because of the PPP loan, but I don't know about ongoing. And then the third thing for us, so one is that scheduling around the caregivers, two is PPE, and three is we used COVID and we curtailed. We used to do in-person introductions, so many things in person from an operational staffing standpoint. And we really were able to use COVID to, it allowed us to cost cut some of the overhead in the office. And it's difficult to maintain it. It's difficult to maintain our quality. We're doing it, but it's difficult to maintain that quality. So they're just things on shaky ground. And again, all of this is, business is great. We have, again, more hours than we've ever had, but I just feel really fragile around this. Speaking of the fragility around caregivers, I'll just say the one last thing. I wouldn't even necessarily all call it economic fragility or whatever that term was. Caregivers are fragile. They're emotionally fragile.
Yes.
I worry about caregivers' mental health right now. I have one of my top 40-hour-a-week caregivers who is, she just had to call off because she said, I cannot take one more death. With everything going on right now, I can't do this work anymore.
Very good. Thanks, Sandy. Appreciate that. Jean Caldwell, you still with us? Unmute if you're there.
Yes, I'm here.
Tell me the big issues you're facing, John, down in New Orleans.
Well, I think, of course, like everybody else, there's never enough staff, especially nurses right now. As we were kind of growing prior to COVID, we've been revamping a lot of our operations again before COVID. So that added this other layer. And so we kind of took it to the next, I guess, the next layer. So there's more operational issues we're dealing with rather than caregivers. I have to say our caregivers have been extremely loyal and dedicated, as many of them have not jumped at the unemployment benefits. They wanted to stay with their patients. So I really applaud them on that. They're very dedicated. So we're trying to give them raises and going forward. So that hasn't been too bad, but as like everybody else, we need more caregivers and more patients.
Okay, thanks, John. Appreciate it. Bob Roth, tell me about the big issues you're facing at Cypress these days.
I'm going to unmute here. So, first of all, I agree with Glenn. There's a lot been said about caregivers in the chat box. I've had a chance to talk to a number of different agencies. We know that COVID's going to be here for some time now, and some agencies have had some success. And Stephen, you may have heard this even in the mastermind group, because I know one of them is an attendee of the mastermind groups. And that is, we almost need to recruit COVID-specific caregivers and keep them separate from the caregivers that are working on non-COVID cases. So I know some agencies have had some success in that. I want to learn more about that, because I think we're going to see a lot more COVID cases to come. I think the other issue is really connecting with our referral partners. We don't get a chance to see them and talk to them. And, there's definitely some Zoom fatigue. And I think all of us are feeling that. But at the same time, I think we need to find new ways. And I think it was discussed, back on the office hours, maybe back in June, some of the agencies are using video, some of them are using other ways and means. I want to learn from others in terms of how they are connecting with existing as well as new referral partners. And I think the last one, I think I would really like to highlight is advocacy. As you know, it's a very big, important mission of ours at Home Care Association of America. We have a lot of things that are happening, as many of you know, Glenn, right there in your backyard. On August 3rd, the U.S. District Court of Southern District of New York issued a decision vacating the provision of the final rule related to the work availability requirement and the definition of the healthcare provider. And, I don't know how many people were stretching the rules as related to family leave, but certainly that was not a really good positive decision for home care, because we felt like home care was part of healthcare. And I think, as evidenced by the move from home health, and I know Tom Glott is on the phone here, they were working really hard to get the review choice demonstration, the RCD, delayed in the throes of everything else that home health has had to deal with in terms of the patient-driven groupings model and then the RAP. I think one of the things that came from that is to show that, wow, home health came together. I know in Florida, they had like 11,000 people respond. So I think right now is really our time. And we talked about this early on in your office hours, that home care should be the shining star. And, we really need to come together as it relates to advocacy, letting our state legislators know, as well as our U.S. legislators know the importance of home care. And certainly communal living has got its own fair share of challenges. And this still is our time. And that's really all I have right now, Stephen. So thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Appreciate you being with us. I'm still going around my screen with people who have their cameras on. Carrie has her camera on. Carrie, what are the big burning issues you face? And tell us where you're located, Carrie.
Minneapolis.
Okay.
So we, of course, one of the burning issues was, caregivers, getting them to stay, in buying into the culture of the company. And it was very hit and miss with us. And, because we're using our director who's busy with so many other things, and business could be up a lot more, but without the caregivers, of course, we can't handle it. So what we decided to do, which so far so good, has been a good move, is to hire a full-time HR person. And they're just combing through everything, being in touch with the caregivers right away, starting them out on the right foot, getting them bought into the culture. So we're going at it from that approach for now.
Are you seeing some success with that, Carrie?
So far, yes. This is her third week.
Okay.
But we are. She seems to be really jumping in and recognizing any issues that were there that we didn't recognize and that were being glossed over. She is seeing it. So, I'm glad to report on that as time goes on, what she's been seeing. But it looks like at this point that we are having success.
Very good. Good. Any other burning issues that you're dealing with besides the caregiver issues?
So far, it's pretty much that. I received a grant that I applied for PPE equipment, and it's a matter of being able to use it and, being able to train enough to, and I feel kind of at a loss. I mean, I think there could be better training that we're not doing, so kind of researching that a little bit more.
Okay. Very good. And very good. Thanks, Carrie. Appreciate you being with us. Cameron Nasser is with us. Cameron, how are you today?
I put one out there on the credenza.
Can you unmute, Cameron? Yeah, there you go. Tell us about your burning issues.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah, good to see you. Well, I'm really just trying to catch up with the industry. I don't know if you remember or not. We talked last year, and I actually sold my home care agency last year.
Oh, okay.
And in preparation for kind of launching my new company, I'm trying to just catch up with the industry to see what's happening. So that was my goal, to really get on this call and find out how everybody's doing. And
okay.
It's just, great information. Thank you so
Good.
much.
Well, glad you're with us. Glad you were able to sell your business successfully. I've talked to a couple of folks who are giving that some thought. So best wishes. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Others, if you have other burning issues, you can put them in the chat room. So far, everything up here is about caregivers. We can't hire enough. Burning issues 1, 2, and 3, not getting enough caregivers. 1, 2, and 3, nobody wants to work, cannot hire. So obviously, we've attracted a lot of folks because of the topic of economically fragile caregivers. So let me take a moment and share my screen. Oh, wrong screen. Sorry about that. There we go. And bring everybody up to date. Thank you for participating in Burning Issues. Back in May, as we were doing our monthly mastermind meetings, and for those of you who may not be familiar with the Home Care CEO Forum, we have 4 Home Care CEO mastermind groups, different size companies that meet twice a year face-to-face and once a month by video conference. So at our May video meetings, we ask everybody in each of the groups to identify their top 3 burning issues. And on the screen, you can see the top 7 issues and the percentages of our members who identified that as one of their top 3 issues. Marketing strategies was number 1, and sales strategies was number 3. And so in June and July, we talked about those topics. And then caregiver recruiting and retention was 3 of the top 7 issues. And so we've been moving forward. And throughout the summer, we at Leading Home Care and the Home Care CEO Forum have really been looking at this whole issue of caregiver recruiting and retention. And we're in the midst of re-engineering and redesigning something that we call caregiver quality assurance. And we'll be sharing more details with you in September and doing a soft launch of the caregiver quality assurance program in October. But basically the program is going to be an online learning system with 5 courses, and each course has 7 lessons. So a total of 35 online learning lessons around the 5 elements of caregiver quality assurance. Element number 1 is the caregiver quality company culture. Element number 2, in course number 2, is the caregiver quality recruiting system. Course number 3 is caregiver quality selection system. Course number 4 is caregiver quality onboarding system. And course number 5 is the caregiver quality retention system. And as I mentioned, there'll be 7 lessons in each course. And one of the things that has come out of the development of all this material and doing the research is this concept that we call retaining economically fragile caregivers. And so what I'm going to do today is just take a moment and share some of the research that we have discovered around this concept of economically fragile caregivers and how that may relate. And Sandy McCann, in talking about burning issues, shared with us that these caregivers are just emotionally fragile at this point. And that's exactly right. It's tied together because the economic plays a big part in that. And so who are these economically fragile caregivers? Well, they face 4 major insecurities. Financial insecurity is the big one. And oftentimes we think about the amount that they earn on an hourly basis, but what we're learning is that, yeah, that's a key issue, but it's more how many hours a week are they getting and what's the total amount in their paycheck and what happens if they miss a day's work or 2 days work or they have some other catastrophe. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. The financial insecurity leads to food insecurity, having enough food or the right food or healthy food to feed themselves and their families. And that ties down into housing insecurity in that in many markets, there's a shortage of affordable housing or that if people are facing other financial insecurity, they're not able to pay their rent and they're forced to move and all of the things that go along with housing. And that is tied closely to transportation insecurity. And of course, you all know that to have a caregiver work in your business, they need to have transportation. Hopefully they own a car, but we're finding lots of different issues that relate to transportation. And so we recognize that this becomes a pretty complex issue for these caregivers. And what we have learned in doing the research is that economically fragile caregivers or workers are, number one, elusive. They're not really very open to expressing themselves about their lifestyle issues or the challenges that they face. We find that they're not responsible to offers of assistance. And that's one of the things that has been baffling to many home care leaders is they try to reach out and provide assistance to caregivers, and they're not responsive to that. They're not responsive to, for example, taking advantage of benefits that are offered. And we find that these economically fragile caregivers are doing their best to make everything look okay and make everyone think that they are okay. And that is part of what adds to the complexity. And it was very interesting in doing this research. We came across this quote that said, "The opposite of poverty is not wealth, it is dignity." And when we look at that opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's dignity, it caused me to remember a book that I have on my bookshelf, and I went over and pulled it off, The book is called We Weren't Poor, We Just Didn't Have Any Money. And it's by a friend and professional speaking colleague of mine here in Kentucky, the name of Carl Hurley. And when I first met Carl, he was called the funny professor, and he was a professor at Eastern Kentucky University. Went on to become a full-time professional speaker, just an amazing guy. But he grew up in a little tiny village in the mountains of Eastern Kentucky. And he talks in his humorous presentations about his life growing up without any money. But what we realized and what he expressed is that being poor is a mindset, and it may or may not have anything to do with the amount of money that you have. And so as we think about these economically fragile workers, what they really need in order to overcome the fragility is dignity, not necessarily more money. Obviously, money helps, but that's not the only part of the solution. And we came across this other quote that says, people go to great lengths to conceal their economic fragility to maintain their dignity. And this comes from a book that we have referenced, and it was introduced to us by a client of ours in Pennsylvania. The book is called The Talent Pool by Sharon Ryan and Cynthia Tolsma. And Sharon is a CEO and Cynthia is a vice president of a company in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania called Dasher Inc. And their business deals in communication and communication services. And many of their employees are developmentally disabled or physically disabled, and most of them are economically fragile. And so in building their company and working with these workers, they have studied and researched this concept of economic fragility. And another quote that they shared with us in the book is, the degree of complexity in the lives of economically fragile people is mind-blowing. Tunnel vision occurs and the pressure erodes their decision-making. And I think this, again, is in parallel to what Sandy was saying about the emotional fragility of these workers, is that when they get into a complex situation, this tunnel vision occurs and it causes them to make poor decisions. So if you're interested, the book is called, again, The Talent Pool by Sharon Ryan and Cynthia Tolsma. It's from Expert Press in Dasher, Pennsylvania. It is available on Amazon, and their company is called Dasher Incorporated, Dasher Inc., and you can go to their website if you want to explore this. One of the concepts that they shared in the book, and we've again dug more deeply into, is what they call the flat tire catastrophe. And it could be a flat tire, it could be the air conditioning going out, it could be any other economic catastrophe, where we tend to think of the expense of, in this case, repairing the tire, but it also relates to other elements of the catastrophe. If they can't get to work today, they lose a day's pay. If they lose a day's pay, they can't pay their utility bill, and then they're behind, and now they're trying to catch up. And so they have to catch up on the utility bill in time to avoid having the electricity shut off, and that makes them late on the rent. And then catching up on the rent means they can't put food on the table, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as we said, these economically fragile caregivers are elusive, and so they're not sharing with us the issues they face and the challenges they face. And so all of this is going on behind the scenes, and we're not aware of it. And so we're not understanding why they are a no-call, no-show, or why they call off 3 times in a week. And as we were talking about this in one of the mastermind groups, one of the members was sharing an experience where they had a caregiver who had been one of their top caregivers for 4 or 5 years and rarely missed a shift, worked extra hours, was really a sort of a model caregiver employee. And then all of a sudden she started calling off and not showing up. And they knew there was something going on, but they couldn't ever figure out what it was. And then one day she just disappeared, sort of fell off the radar. And I'm sure you've all had examples of that, and it comes from something like the flat tire catastrophe that creates a cascade of events that just overwhelms them, and then they disappear off your radar screen. So how do you recognize these economically fragile caregivers who want to remain undetected? And I think this goes back to our recruiting and selection process as we're interviewing, and then also to our engagement process as we engage these caregivers through the onboarding process and through our systems for retaining caregivers. One of the early signs of an economically fragile caregiver is that they're the only person working in a multi-person household. And again, I know you've seen lots of examples of that. A sign of this would be a caregiver who's driving an older model vehicle with unrepaired body damage. So they've had a minor fender bender, they don't have that $400 or $800, or they don't have the deductible for their car insurance to have the car repaired, and so they're driving it around with the body damage. Relying on the emergency room for their primary health care, and we know that even some of these folks that have taken advantage of the health insurance plans that you offered can't afford the copays and the deductibles to actually go to a physician, and so they go to the emergency room when they need some problems with healthcare issues. A big one that we see, and I'm sure you have seen this, is a caregiver whose spouse or children have been involved with the legal system. They've been arrested for something, they're involved in court cases, they're involved in a variety of different aspects of the legal system. And not only does it take cash to resolve those, but it is emotionally draining as well. We move on, and number 5 is dealing with cash only. They can't get a bank account. If you have caregivers who don't want to participate in your direct deposit program because they don't have a bank account, and often it's because, number 6, they have a history of repeated overdrafts, and so the banks won't give them an account. So these are clues and indicators. Failure to enroll in company benefits, and again, when we rolled out the Affordable Care Act, and many of you are companies large enough that you were required to offer the health insurance benefit, and we saw all across the industry a relatively small percentage of caregivers who chose to enroll in the health insurance program. And again, it's another sign of people who are economically fragile. You have caregivers who are enrolled in government programs such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the SNAP program, we used to call it food stamps, or CHIPS, the Children's Health Insurance Program. So these are some of the kinds of things that we saw that are signs or signals of a caregiver who is economically fragile. And so why do we care about this concept of economic fragility? And it's because it contributes to all of the things that we were talking about earlier, about not being able to find enough caregivers who want to work. And yeah, there are folks out there who don't want to work, but oftentimes we find that there are folks who want to work, but because of the complex nature of this condition called economic fragility, they make poor decisions and they do things that are not indicative of somebody who wants to work. And so we as leaders who focus and address this are finding out that we can maximize our returns on caregiver recruitment by building the kind of company that is empathic toward these caregivers who experience economic fragility, and create a home for them and build a level of trust where they are willing to come and work with us and be more open to sharing some of their issues. It's a way of reducing the cost of caregiver turnover, because if we can have a team of people who are aware of and understanding of this principle of economic fragility, we can reduce the cost of turnover. And obviously, it's also a way of differentiating your agency in the eyes of clients and prospects and referral sources when you're able to share with them the things that you are doing to recruit and select and onboard and retain your caregivers. And one element of this whole process that we're now calling caregiver quality assurance is being aware of the concept of economic fragility and putting in place people and processes and systems, and in some cases, emergency financial funds to help these caregivers work through these issues. And when your clients and their families and your referral sources see that you are a company that cares about your caregivers, that you're dealing with some of the emotional issues that they're facing, with some of the economic issues that they're facing, that it places you and your company in a more positive light. It helps to build the brand promise. And so I love this quote that I saw in doing our research. You can change their lives. Dignified, family-sustaining work is indeed more effective in lifting people out of poverty than any aid program, because it enables people to experience the kind of freedom, adventure, independence that people with money take for granted. And when I read that quote, it resonated with me because, yeah, there are lots of things that you and I take for granted because we do have the money that minimizes some of that stress. And if we can build companies that help provide that dignified family-sustaining work, and we can help our caregivers work through the flat tire catastrophe and continue to get the hours that they need and the dollars that they need to sustain themselves, it does have a payoff for us as well. And so then we begin to ask the question, what systems can you set up to engage and care for your economically fragile caregivers? And that's part of what we're going to be doing with the Caregiver Quality Assurance Program, is bringing companies together, bringing individuals together to share ideas, to share best practices, to support one another, to solve problems. And so as we roll out Caregiver Quality Assurance beginning in September and October, we will bring in the mastermind principle that we have introduced through our Home Care CEO Forum. Our mastermind groups will have HR directors and recruiters and schedulers and other home care team members participating and engaging these conversations. So that's a quick overview of this concept of economic fragility. If you have questions, we're going to take some questions right now, but as we roll out the Caregiver Quality Assurance Program, we are in the process of setting up an email account for questions at caregiverquality.com, and that's not quite ready yet, but it will be. And as you participate in any of the programs of the online learning, you'll have access to that information. So that's coming. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of the research that we are doing. What questions does that raise for you about this principle, or what comments do you have about your experience in dealing with economically fragile caregivers? You can feel free to type your thoughts into the chat box. You can type your questions into the chat box. Annalise Gear is with us, and she types, can't most caregivers be considered economically fragile? Annalise, I think you're exactly right. Annalise, are you with us? Can you hear us? If you want to unmute, and I know that you do a lot of work in HR and recruiting and retention and home care. Thanks for being with us today. Tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing with your clients in terms of this principle, Annalise.
Hi, Steve. Yes, thanks for allowing me to speak. It's, I think it's the reason why I put that question is, as I was listening to how you define economically fragile caregivers, I think most caregivers will meet at least a couple of those criteria. It is truly the rare bird in an agency that where a caregiver doesn't meet at least a couple of those criteria. And not just caregivers, by the way, the office staff as well, I find.
That's a good point. And as we've been talking about this month, you're exactly right, Annalise. Many of our mastermind members have said, well, it not only affects my caregivers, but I have schedulers and other office team members who may be the sole worker in a multi-member family, and they're facing some of these same issues. So Annalise, when you're working with your home care clients, and Annalise as a HR consultant and professional, has worked in a number of industries, but does a lot of work right now with home care folks. Annalise, what are you seeing in terms of how some of your clients are dealing with their economically fragile caregivers?
So what I find that's very not surprising, but and I never really thought about it in those terms quite the way you describe it. So that's why I was intrigued by it, and I wanted to join the session this afternoon. But I think there's this pervasive feeling amongst the staff and an agency that caregivers want to be paid, but they don't want to work, right? So, yeah. and there's probably some truth to that, right? But where you see a different behavior is really based on how long the caregiver has been around. So if it's somebody who, just like you described, has been a good caregiver for a year and suddenly something happens, they have that track record of, oh, it's not that they're lazy, it must be something going on in their lives. I'm always amazed by how complex the life of a caregiver is because of all the things you've described. And that's something I speak to often when I talk about caregiver retention in particular, is the fact that because they have such complex lives, usually the first thing to go is work, because that's something they can control. I can't deal with all this, so I'm not going to show for work. Not a good decision, clearly, but I think that's very often how the decision-making process happens.
You're absolute, Annalise, and you mentioned retention, and one of the things I'm working on right now are the content details for the learning course on our caregiver quality retention system. And one of the things that we have been digging into is understanding turnover. And of course, all of us are familiar with the Home Care Pulse benchmarking study, and they've been tracking caregiver turnover for 11 years now. And of course, it started in 39% back in 2009 and peaked at 82% in 2018, and then it's come back down just a little bit in 2019. But the other piece of data that we learned from that study, or at least from Home Care Pulse, I don't think it's been published in the study till maybe this year, is that 80% of the turnover happens in the first 90 days.
Right. No, so that's been known for a while, and that's the other thing the other point I wanted to make, and then I'll mute myself, is that the first 90 days is what I call the danger zone. So if you can capture the caregiver for that first 90 days and get them engaged and productively working. The other thing that, I have seen time and again, especially larger agencies, they spend a lot of time and effort recruiting, and then their scheduler drops the ball by not scheduling those caregivers to work. And guess what? Caregivers, when they show up, they want money now, not next week, not 2 weeks from now. They want to get a case today. And we all know that's really the art of scheduling is complicated, but that's also a big part of what happens is they drop off quickly because they're not getting the work quickly enough.
You're exactly right, Annalise, and that was sort of where I was headed as we go into this conversation, is that we talk about retention, but as we have studied 90-day retention, we've identified three important elements of keeping people past 90 days. And as you said, if you can keep them past 90 days, the probability that they will stay for a year goes way up. If you keep them for a year, the probability they'll stay for 3 years goes way up. And so what can we do to keep those caregivers past 90 days? And the first thing we've learned from studying this is we need to do a better job of selection. Because there's such a shortage of caregivers that we ease up on our selection criteria and we hire people, and then they find out this isn't the kind of work that they want to do, or they find out I'm not a good fit for this company, and they leave in 2 weeks or 4 weeks.
Yeah, that's the proverbial warm body, right? We're just going to get somebody in there and see what happens.
That's right. And so course number 2 in our caregiver quality assurance program is all about the caregiver recruiting selection system. Course number 3. So we'll be doing a lot more research into how we do a better job of selection, of getting the right people. And it's not only the right people for the job, but it's the right people for our company culture. And that's why the first element in the first course is around the caregiver quality company culture. What's the culture of a company that makes a great place to work for caregivers? And now that we're in this concept of economically fragile caregivers, how can our culture contribute to that? So number 1 is selection. The second one is the one you just mentioned, Annalise, and that is we have to keep them working the number of hours that they want to work. And we know not everybody wants to work full time. They don't want to work 40 hours. Some people want to work 20 hours, but if they come to us and they want to work 20 and they're only getting 10, they're going to leave. If they want to work 40 and they're only getting 30, they're going to leave. And the other part of that we discovered is oftentimes we hire a caregiver, they fit our criteria, they look like a good employee, we complete our onboarding process and our employee orientation process, and then we give them a schedule, and let's say they want to work 40 and they're scheduled for 35, and they have 3 different clients, and sometime in that 90 days, they lose one of those clients. And so now instead of working 35 hours a week, they're now working 25 hours a week. And when they get that paycheck, that's not enough to pay the rent. And so they start looking for some other source of money to pay the rent, and they find it somewhere else. And suddenly we have lost them because we haven't given them enough hours and therefore not enough dollars to meet their economic needs and expectations. And so part of the reason is they lose that one client and they lose that 10 hours a week. And as you said, the scheduler doesn't yet know that person because they're brand new. It's their first 90 days. And the schedulers, as we all know, tend to go to the people that they know and like, the people who will bail them out. And we lose a lot of people simply because the schedulers don't reach out to them and get them the hours that they need. And so how do we keep these new caregivers in their first 90 days in front of the schedulers so that they will be scheduled to get the number of hours that they need? And then the third big element of 90-day retention is the whole area of employee engagement, staying connected. One of the things I did in working on this information was go back and review the results of our best caregiver study. And we've done 2 different best caregiver studies in the last 5 years. And when we look at what we learned from talking to our best caregivers, the reason best caregivers work in home care and stay in home care and stay with a particular company is, number 1, doing meaningful work. They want to do this work. They care about caring for the elderly. And, we have a number of comments on here about finding people who really want to work. And we know that there are some. It's sort of a bell-shaped curve. And the people on the upper end of the bell-shaped curve are people who really see themselves as a professional caregiver. They want to do this work. They love their clients. And so doing meaningful work. The second is appreciation, feeling valued and appreciated by their clients and families, feeling valued and appreciated by their immediate supervisor, and feel valued and appreciated by company leadership. And so that ties back into this engagement. It's interesting, as we looked at the best caregiver study, another element in there was flexibility. The best caregivers like to decide when they work and when they don't work. And so that flexibility, and actually fair pay turned out to be item number 7 of the top 7 items of why caregivers stay. And so it's not so much the hourly rate as it is, am I getting enough hours and does my paycheck meet the needs that I have? And that's where it all ties back into this concept of economic fragility. So the pieces of the puzzle are coming together as we do this research. It's a matter of how we apply them. And of course, it's not easy. It's a complex, difficult situation. So thanks, Annalise, for being here. Appreciate your insights. Who else has some observations or comments or questions about any of the things that we've been talking about so far this afternoon?
Steve, if I could ask you a question. I'm
Sure,
a little bit
Dan.
confused. I'm a little bit confused, and maybe I'm missing your point. I'm not sure, but I was under the understanding that the reason why caregivers take a job generally is because of pay, but the reason why they stay is because of the things you just mentioned: the appreciation, the perks, the 401k, dental, training is usually a big thing. But yet, I'm hearing that money is still important to them. I mean, they're economically fragile. They need money to sustain their families. So which one is it? Do they stay because of money, or do they stay because of training? Do they stay because of appreciation? Which one is the most important? Benchmark study says one thing. I hear you and other people saying other things. I'm just really confused at this point.
Well, appreciate that, Dan. You're exactly right. It is confusing. And I think for caregivers, it's confusing. But we learned an interesting lesson in one of our mastermind conversations about a year ago. It was a conversation over several different mastermind meetings. In that we were talking about this very question of how important is money in attracting new caregivers, and how important is money in keeping existing caregivers. And in the conversation, one of our members was asking some questions of the other members about this topic, and he said, I got this idea. And he said, I went back home after our face-to-face meeting, and I looked at all of my job ads. And this is a company that's been in one of our top tier mastermind groups for many, many years, actually since the very beginning. And they have built what I think is an amazing company culture, and it's a great place to work. And he said we were having turnover was not as big an issue as attraction of recruiting caregivers. He said, I went back and I looked at all of my job ads, and all of my job ads focused on the company culture and the retention issues of doing meaningful work, of feeling valued and appreciated, of flexibility, and didn't mention money at all. So he said, I went back and I reworded some of my job ads. I wrote new headlines, I wrote new body copy, and he said, I did not increase the number of dollars I was paying per hour, but I talked about money and money-related benefits in the job ad. And he said, my number of applications went up by 400%. But he said, obviously, by doing that, I got a lot of applicants that I didn't want to hire. So he said, I really needed to refocus on my selection system. But he said, in the end, after I increased the number of applicants and I boosted my selection, I ended up with more high quality hires and people who stayed with me. And so to your point, we coined this phrase that said, money matters more in recruiting than in retention. But if you're going to mention money in the ads, you really need to beef up your selection system, because you'll get a lot of applicants when you mention money, but they won't necessarily be the people that you want to send out into the homes of your clients, and they aren't necessarily the folks who will stay past that initial 90 days. And so there needs to be a balance. And Dan, I think you nailed it when you say, which is it? Well, it's not either or, it's sort of both. And coming out of that research and the idea that money matters more, one of the things that I looked at with some of our companies is where are they in their local marketplace in terms of their bill rates and in terms of their pay rates? And how does that relate to the competition, both the competition for clients and the competition for caregivers? And I created a principle, and some of you have heard me share this. If you take a bell-shaped curve and the median is the 50th percentile, the principles that we looked at was, what would it take for us to be at the 70th percentile, both in bill rate and pay rate? And obviously, if you're going to charge more, you've got to deliver more. And if you're going to pay more, then you have to be more selective, and you need to build the other elements of the culture that will keep those people past 90 days. It doesn't do any good just to throw money at them if they leave. And it doesn't do any good to just throw money at them if you shrink your margins and affect your ability to sustain your business. So it is that balance. And I know we've talked about this in some of the mastermind groups about what does it take us to move to the 70th percentile in bill rate and pay rate, and how do we take that extra money and use it to our advantage to attract high quality applicants, but then also engage them in the process and keep them engaged. And this all ties back again to the concept of today of economic fragility, that if we pay more per hour, but they're working less hours and their paycheck at the end of the week is still less, they're going to leave. But if we pay the same rate, but give them as many hours as they want so that the dollars in their paycheck match the needs that they have and the wants, we increase the probability that they're going to stay. We don't guarantee it. And of course, then we have the flat tire catastrophe where somebody is getting their $480 a week or whatever it is that they need, but now they have a financial catastrophe that causes them to have to spend money on something else and take it away from paying the rent, paying the electric bill, putting food on the table. Dan, that's a long answer to a short question. What do you think about that? You have some other thoughts or other parts of the question?
Yes, one more thought on the question. Daily pay, which is a new concept.
Yes.
And bonuses paid to take a shift. Are those things that you think would give a caregiver more incentive, or do you think they would still not stay in this fragile economic worker situation?
I think those are two great questions. And let's start with the concept of daily pay. Daily pay is something that's been around for, I've been familiar with, there's actually a company called Daily Pay, but then there are a number of home care companies who have built in their own mechanism for paying people on a daily basis. The principle of the company Daily Pay is basically an ATM card, and their system is connected to your payroll system, and a caregiver can withdraw, I think it's up to 60% of the money that they earned on any given day. So they can, I'm going to use round numbers here, but let's say a caregiver works and earns $100 today. Tomorrow they could go to Daily Pay with their card and take out $60. The challenge with it is it's like the payday loan thing, and they're everywhere. So there's obviously lots of people that can't manage their money well, or that have these flat tire catastrophes. They need money today. And the Daily Pay charges them $1.50 or $3. There's some criteria, and I can't remember specifically. But let's say somebody's taking out $60 and they're going to pay a $1.50 ATM fee for that. What's that in interest rate? And that's the grabber. If people are doing that every week or a couple times a week, the percentage of their pay that they're paying to the Daily Pay company is a pretty high percentage, and it approaches some of the interest rates that they're paying for payday loans. The other part of your question, Dan, was about incentives or bonuses to take a shift. and I suspect all of us on the call have experimented with that or tried that. And you've all heard me say, what gets measured gets managed, what gets rewarded gets repeated. And what gets rewarded gets repeated. If we reward people for taking an extra shift by paying a bonus, they will take an extra shift. And after a while, they begin to expect the bonus. And pretty soon, if you're paying $15 during the week and you're paying $18, you're paying a bonus on the weekend. Now, in fact, $18 becomes the rate for weekend shifts. And pretty soon, to get people to work those weekend shifts, you got to pay them that incentive. And that becomes the challenge. And Glenn Lane, I see you nodding your head on that. I know you've had some experience with that. What's your experience and what's your observation about that, paying incentives to take a shift or to?
It's just a hard thing to undo. And just as much as you can standardize, whether you decide, for example, weekends, which we struggle with, and we haven't done this yet, but we debate about whether we should be billing and or paying more per hour for weekend work versus gun to head offering the 50, 100, whatever it is to do that. Also, we're finding it's much better just to have people on call and pay them a set amount. During the very difficult times, we were paying about 10 people 40 hours or guaranteeing them 40 hours to be available. We still have a certain number we do that with, but we find better luck with that than the one-time gun to head situations where you're scrambling.
Okay, good. Bob Roth, you waved your hand at me and now I lost you on the screen. You still here? We must have lost him. He's going to make a comment in any. Other observations, comments about this concept of paying an incentive to take an extra shift or to take a weekend or evening shift?
Steve, this is Annalise. I just wanted to comment on the daily pay. I also know of some payroll companies that will actually provide a daily paycheck to the caregiver. It's obviously expensive to the agency because they have to pay every time the payroll is run. And back in, 2019, early 2020, that was potentially an attractive option for some agencies because they were competing with, for instance, the hospitality restaurant industry where there is tips, and every day once you finish your shift, you've got cash in hand and you can go gas up your car, you can go buy some groceries, which, if you pay bi-weekly, which some agencies do, or even sometimes weekly, it's hard for those economically fragile caregivers to even have enough money to, make it through the week nowadays. And so that was used as a way to attract or retain caregivers away from those sort of cash businesses. Now we all know that, the restaurant industry is suffering terribly. And so that's not really an option as a sort of a competing industry to lose your caregiver to. I don't know if you're planning on talking about, do we have an increase in the labor force now that we have a recession on our hands, which traditionally, I've been around the home care industry long enough to have seen at least one full economic cycle, and where typically a tough economic environment creates more labor force for the home care industry.
Yes, you're exactly right, Annalise. And that was one of the things we were looking at and watching for, is with the rest of the economy being affected by COVID, as people were being laid off in the food service and hospitality industries, would there be more people available to work in home care? And I haven't seen any evidence of that yet because of the unemployment benefits. People made more money staying home than they could coming to work with us. But you're absolutely right about that, and also about the daily pay. A couple of other comments that are in the chat box, and you can go there and look. Our friend Dale Brock from Fort Worth says, we offer payday loans, not the kind you think of, but payroll advances of up to $250. They pay it back over 2 to 6 pay days. Through payroll deduction, we limit it to one each 90 days. And so this is an example of a solution for that flat tire catastrophe. If somebody gets into a crunch, they can get a payroll advance of up to $250. Dale, are you still on there? I saw you a minute ago.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Tell us a little bit more, Dale, about the impact of that on things like the flat tire catastrophe, and what's been the impact of that in terms of caregiver retention, and is that a recruiting advantage as well?
You know, we haven't promoted it per se, Stephen. It's kind of word of mouth. There's a little bit of a hassle factor to it, but there's a bigger hassle to losing a caregiver.
Right.
We have 2 or 3 frequent flyers. We're fine. We enforce the structure of the program, but I think it validates what you're saying, because typically when they call, they want to come in that afternoon and pick up the check. And that's where a little bit of hassle factor comes in, but it's really not. And they're very appreciative, and it's confidential. So nobody knows that they had to borrow $250. And I've heard agencies putting like a food closet in the office, but then they got to walk in and pick up the food, you know. So maybe a little bit of an embarrassment factor there. But this is pretty confidential, and it's worked well. And I've often wondered if we shouldn't promote it a little more with our caregivers that do have flat tires or an expensive prescription or an ER visit or something like that.
Right. One of our clients that I worked with on strategic business coaching, and actually the person who introduced me to this concept called the talent pool, the book, The Talent Pool. And in the book, the company Dasher Inc. Has set up an emergency fund for their employees. And so my client in the home care space was looking at how could he set up an emergency fund, and he's still figuring out the logistics and the legality of it. But in essence, what he was looking at was setting up a not-for-profit entity that he could contribute money to, that caregivers could contribute money to if they chose, and that clients could contribute money to be an emergency fund that caregivers could borrow from and then pay back, and the money would be available to loan to another caregiver to pay back. And what he discovered in looking at it was it sounds easy. There's a lot more to it, as you're dealing with charitable organization regulations in each state. You're dealing with somebody to manage it. You're dealing with what if people don't pay. So there's multiple issues. But I think the concept of having a fund that caregivers could go to, as you said, Dale, confidentially, because they don't want anybody to know that they need that extra $250. This elusiveness, this non-disclosure piece is an interesting element of this situation that we're dealing with.
Well, that sounds more like a benevolence fund that they would not have to repay.
Well, and that was one of the things he was initially. He said, "What if we just did a benevolence fund, and if somebody needed $400, we gave it to them?" Then you get into the criteria of how you determine who gets the money. And he and I had that conversation because I was the chairman of the board of our National Speakers Association Foundation. The foundation was set up and operates what we call the Professional Speakers Benefit Fund. So if we have members of our association who have some kind of a personal catastrophe and they don't have any money, they will get a grant from this foundation. But there are certain criteria for who's eligible and who's not eligible, and what are the conditions that create eligibility. So you get into that kind of, and then who makes the decision. We have a whole committee of people who review those applications and make decisions. But yeah, you're exactly right. It could be a benefit fund, or it could be a loan fund, but it gets a little bit more complicated. But I think it helps us to understand the complexity of this issue and the complexity of solving the issue for the benefit of our caregivers. Thanks so much, Dale. Appreciate your insight. Any other questions or comments or observations? Let me just scroll down the chat box here for a moment. Couple of other questions about bonuses. Somebody says, one of the things we give to beef up our benefits package is a Costco or Sam's Club membership. The other thing, you talked about the flat tire catastrophe. One of the things that a number of our clients have done in the past, I haven't heard much about it recently, was giving a AAA membership to new employees. And so if your car won't start or you have a flat tire, you don't call off and not show up, you call AAA and have them come out and fix the tire or start the car or whatever else is required. And one of our clients years ago had a relationship with an automobile repair shop in their neighborhood. And they were able to work out a deal with the owner of this auto shop. And if somebody had a problem, they had a flat tire, they ran out of gas, the battery wouldn't start the car, they would call the garage. He would go out with his tow truck. He would get them going again. If their car needed towed, he'd tow it into his shop. He would fix it, get it back to them quickly, and then the company would guarantee that, and the employee could pay for the car repairs through their payroll deduction program. And that worked with them for a while. So there are lots of issues, lots of things that people are doing or have done to deal with this issue of economic fragility. Conway says, Dale, that's a brilliant solution. Thanks, Conway. Dale makes another point. Daily pay doesn't seem to encourage good budgeting. Has anyone offered financial education in services? Another great question. And the answer is yes. As we have studied this concept of economic fragility, one of the things that some companies are doing is offering in-service education programs on a voluntary basis for any caregivers who want to learn more about things like budgeting, things like paying off your debt, the value of getting rid of your credit card debt, all of those kinds of things that help people to get past the economic fragility part of it. Conway, I'm going to put you on the spot here, my friend, but we were talking about this the other day on our fishing trip, and you were talking about some of the things that you've done for people in your work around economic soundness, teaching principles, and you were talking about some of the things. I'm sure you've got an insight or two that you'd be willing to share with these folks.
Well, I just appreciate the work that you guys are doing. I know how difficult this is. And you're so right, Stephen, this fragility is just so crazy. I mean, you know, one flat tire can start a cascade of stuff. So I applaud all the people around the room here who are actually dealing with this on a daily basis. I know how difficult it is. I've been teaching with some young ladies trying to get out of the sex trade business. There's a couple of companies in Louisville that are helping these women get out of that business and halfway houses. And I've been going down doing some stuff. And the first thing I've been trying to teach them is just simple goal setting. Do you have goals for your life? And of course, most of these girls don't. And so the first thing I started with was, can you save $10 in the next 7 days? And a lot of them just, nah. But some of them said, yeah, I think I can do $10 in the next 7 days. And then the education was, well, if you can do 10, can you do 20? If you can do 20, can you do 30? And then if you can do 50 and then 100 and then 1,000, and that way you'll have enough to get an apartment. And I was just trying to teach them with the very basic stuff. And then I also did some education around things like smoking. $5 a cigarette a day, 2 packs a day is $300 a month. That's $3,600 a year. If there's 2 of you in a household doing it, that's $7,400 a year. And one of these girls had her jaw just dropped open. She almost fell on the floor. She had no clue that she was spending $5,000 and $6,000 and $7,000 on cigarettes. And she figured out herself, if she lowered the pack of cigarettes, instead of name brand, she went to the off brand. It would save her $2 a month, $60 a month, $2 a day, $60 a month, and $720 a year just switching cigarette brands. And of course, I don't have to tell you guys, you do the math: 2 packs of cigarettes, 1 beer, 2 packs of cigarettes, 1 energy drink. You do the math, and it's people don't realize that they're spending $10,000, $15,000 on these smaller things. I have not got around to showing them. Your audience, your workers may be more interested in simply $200 a month in the right mutual fund over a 40-year working career. It can be worth $1.2 million if you get it in the right fund. And there's a lot of them out there. I don't, you guys know as much about this as I do probably, but I'm just talking about just Vanguard, S&P 500 kind of stuff. And you can do the math, but I've been doing that math for my nieces and nephews and teenagers and young people starting to work in my church. $200 a month for the next 40 years can be worth a lot of money for you. There's a number of other ideas like this. If you make 13 payments instead of 12 on your house, it can knock off 8 and 10 years. I did this math with a family the other day, and it saved them $70,000 in 8 years on their mortgage. So some of these ideas may be for not your low-level workers, but your next level office workers. But some of these ideas are worth it. Another one that I really like to tell, if I can, just 2 seconds here, Stephen. If you put $8,000 in a mutual fund for a kid when he's 16 years of age, when he retires at age 65, it'll be worth $1.2 million. If he puts $2,000 a year, starting at age 25 to age 65, if he puts $2,000 a year, $80,000, it'll be worth right at $1.2 million. And it's like, why don't parents and grandparents, in-laws think about this? Let's put $8,000 in a mutual fund for a kid when he's 16 and try to help guarantee his retirement and take some pressure off of that in their early years of work. There's a number of these kinds of things, and hopefully a couple of these might be helpful to you, but the smoking and the Cokes and the energy drinks and the beer, just changing brands might be helpful in this fragility scenario.
Thanks, Conway. And Conway has great insights into these kinds of things. One of the things that he has done is through his church and other churches in Louisville raised enough money. How many Habitat houses have you built, Conway? 28, did you tell me the other day?
Yes, I've led the group of churches to build 28 Habitat houses, just using my leadership skills, trying to make a difference in the world. And if we can do 2 more, 29 and 30, we will have contributed $1 million to Habitat here in Louisville. And we're really excited about that. Thanks, Stephen, for letting me share.
Thank you for being with us, Conway. Appreciate that. So I think back to the question is that if we as home care owners and leaders can look for small ways to educate our caregivers about some of these very basic, simple economic principles that perhaps we take for granted, but we can help somebody not spend $5 a day for cigarettes or $5 a day for beer or whatever it is that they're doing, or we can help them build a budget that says we need this much for rent and this much for food and this much for car insurance and so on, and help them plan for that. We improve their lives, and the payback for us is we have people who are less economically fragile and are more willing to do the work that we need to do. So this has been a great conversation. We're coming down toward the bottom of the hour. Thank you all for being with us. Any last minute questions or comments before
Steve,
we wrap?
I have one other thing, if I may.
Yeah.
One thing that wasn't mentioned, and I don't know if Annalise is also still on, but I just wonder if anybody's studied this question. In the last 5 years, we've experienced a huge caregiver shortage. It's only getting worse.
Yes.
My question is, as the care shortage increases, caregivers are very aware of that. So they can easily bounce from one company to another. They could take on 3 different agencies, 4, whatever. If they lose one job, or if they're not a good caregiver, they can go to another agency. So I wonder if anybody studied how this economically fragile economy, or any caregiver, how common that is, how many jobs they're working, how often do they switch agencies? Because maybe all the things we're discussing, whether it be, money or non-money benefits, maybe that doesn't really make a difference. Maybe they just know that they can always get another job. So they're just willing to not show up for a job or call out because they don't care, because they can find another job. I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying, is this the reality of what we're dealing with?
That's a great question, Dan. Annalise, you still there? And do you have a response to Dan's question about how many caregivers work for multiple employers?
Yeah, I'm still here. One of the things that I have found to be less and less accurate is the idea that caregivers want to work less than 40 hours a week. I think most caregivers, if they had the option, they would prefer to work, especially if they like their agency, they would prefer to work for one agency and work maybe 50 hours a week, right? Rather than cobble 2 25-hour-a-week jobs. Of course, the cost of overtime can make that proposition seem expensive, but I always advise my clients, be careful not to be, penny wise and pound foolish, because sure, you're paying 10 hours of overtime on, let's say, I don't know, $13, $15 an hour, but how much does it cost you to recruit a new caregiver, right? So you have to sort of balance that out. So the question from Dan was, do people bounce off by choice or necessity? I think it's, as always, it's probably a mixed picture, right? I mean, some people just are not very committed, and they know that, if I don't go to work today for this agency, I'm going to be fired, but no big deal, because tomorrow I can turn around and get a job within 3 days, basically, right? I mean, that's where we are at this point. But I also know that the caregivers that really like their agency, they would rather stay there if they like the culture of the agency, if they like the work that they're doing at the agency, if they like the type of where the work is located relative to where they live. There's lots of criteria that come into a decision for caregivers. They're more likely to stay. So I think, it's just like we've said before, it's a complex situation, and it's almost on a case-by-case basis. I have not tried to study it on a sort of a systematic, large study approach.
Thanks, Annalise. I appreciate that. And Dan, I think you're exactly right. I think if we looked at the data, and again, I'm making this statement anecdotally, not without having formal data, but and of course you've all heard my favorite quote from W. Edwards Deming, who says, without the data, you're just another person with an opinion. So this is my opinion, but I think you're right. I think a significant number of caregivers who, as Annalise said, want to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week are working with multiple companies. Also, to your point, Dan, I think it's pretty clear that there are a lot of folks who recognize that if I'm not working for you, I can go down the street and get another job tomorrow. And as you were talking about that, I was sort of thinking, and again, I keep going back to the bell-shaped curve. There are people on the upper end of that curve who like the company, like the culture, value you as an employer. They are loyal to you and your clients and whatever, and they're going to stay with you. There are people on the other end of the curve who don't stay anywhere very long. they're unstable, they're dealing with all these issues, they don't have the ability or the willingness to deal with it, and so they're constantly bouncing. And again, they know that they can go to work tomorrow and make a little bit of money, and if that doesn't work, they can go somewhere else and make a little bit of money. And then there are those folks in the middle who are more stable, more loyal, but the flat tire catastrophe comes up and causes them to go work somewhere else. And as Annalise said, there are lots of folks who need that 50 hours a week at whatever, $13 an hour to make their basic needs. And if they have to work for 2 different companies to get that, then it becomes easy for them to float back and forth or go to a 3rd company or a 4th company. And so they don't have that stability. So one of the things we're looking at are what are the things that we can do to help them stay with our company. And as Annalise said, sometimes building a program where you offer them the overtime in exchange for a commitment to stay with you and work with you in the long term becomes an advantage. Alan Surface turned on his camera and he's unmuted, so I bet he wants to share some wisdom with us. Alan.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, it's an important topic, but, we've always said that, great care professionals want to work around other great care professionals who care as much as they do. And I think sometimes that, the whole team needs to be focused on when you do lose some hours for a care professional and they're doing a nice job, is really evaluate the rest of the landscape and asking yourself, do you have any C or D players that have not, that are creating, let's face it, it's Pareto's principle, 20% of your care pros are delivering 80% of your problems. You know it, and probably more importantly, so do your care pros. So whoever you leave on the team and keep them with hours while you're excluding the great people who want those additional hours, I think there's a self-correcting process that needs to go through, and you need to be prepared to take someone off and say, remove those hours from that individual and give them to the people that have a good track record. And then also, one thing that we've really spent a lot of time on is understanding who's working for multiple companies. Personally, it's bad enough to work with one company with all the care coordinators calling to see if they could work shifts. I can't imagine working for 2 or 3. That'd just be a complete nightmare. So we spend a lot of time just asking, what would it take for you to have the confidence in just working with our company, just one company?
Yeah.
And, instead of us thinking about what we need to do, just hearing it directly from the horse's mouth and putting together a game plan to address. That's all I wanted to share.
Good point, Alan. Thank you for that. And I think that does illustrate the point that the caregiver recruiting and retention issue is closely balanced to the sales and marketing issue. And that if we can figure out how to make sure that we're giving our caregivers the hours that they need and want on a consistent basis, and the confidence that if they lose a case, we're very quickly going to get them back to work, overcome some of that fear. And the reason that they may have 2 or 3 different companies that they work for is so that they can always have that some level of security that they can get the hours that they need. And I fully agree, Alan, with the point you made about care professionals want to work with other care professionals who want to work. And I coined this phrase a couple of years ago, and I have to say it really slowly so I get it right. And the phrase is, people who want to work don't want to work with people who don't want to work. And so, as you said, they see that if other caregivers are slacking off, and if nobody does anything about it, then it sends the message it's okay to slack off. And many of you have met my wife, Elizabeth, who's an executive coach, and she says the behavior that is permitted gets promoted. And so, to your point, Alan, if we're not raising people up and building a team of people who really want to work, it makes the situation more difficult. Well, we've had a great conversation. We're at the bottom of the hour. Thank you all very much for being with us. We went to Mondays this month because I took a month off last in July, and we did not have office hours because I was on vacation. And then this month, it would normally been this coming Thursday, and I had a conflict. So we moved it to Monday, but we are going to bring office hours back on Thursdays. It will probably be the fourth Thursday of the month. And Jill and I were looking at the calendar for the rest of the year and putting those on the calendar. We'll have to move around Thanksgiving week a little bit, but we will be with you every month coming forward. And the focus will be on the research that we're doing around caregiver recruiting and retention. We'll be introducing the Caregiver Quality Assurance Program. So stay tuned to your email, and we will let you know about next month. Jill, are you with us? Do you have the date for office hours in September?
Yes, we said September 24th.
September 24th, Thursday, September 24th, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll get you information about the topic for discussion. And I think we're on the fourth Thursday throughout the rest of the year. Looks like the 22nd of October. And then I think November is when we had to adjust it. Is that right? Yes. So we'll be on the 18th of November. So anyway, that's what we have coming forward. Again, thank you all for being with us. If you have questions, comments, don't hesitate to shoot us an email. And thanks, everybody. Appreciate you being here. We'll see you next month.